for a minute.
Yeah, I was like, and then I was like, oh my God, this is really happening. And before I knew it was over, it was sad.
This is crazy. This is so nuts.
I'm Letitia Ferrer,
And I'm Chris Alexander.
and this is Totality Talks, the solar eclipse
It
podcast.
just took my breath away, the whole thing. It's really cool that you can see the corona and you see the sun kind of spewing out from behind the moon.
Welcome back to Totality Talks. In this episode, we have New York's own Joe Rayo. Letitia has the intro this time, so let's jump right in.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Totality Talks. In this episode, we'll be talking with fellow upper-file and a figure in the astronomical and meteorological communities, veteran weatherman, and a Hayden Planetarium lecturer, Joe Rayo. Joe's obsession with the sky began at just 16 years old when he witnessed his first total solar eclipse in July 10th, 1972, from the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. Decades later, his passions has only intensified. He has intercepted 14 total solar eclipses around the globe, and he famously chases the sky, having viewed 6 eclipses, is that right, from a plane? Or 5?
Five.
Five
of
eclipses from a plane.
Five.
And they were
Again,
all...
I lose count myself.
Okay. And they were all by convincing airlines to delay or modify their route, or did you do any of the special eclipse flights?
Out of the 5, 2 of them were actually the progenitor of those 2 eclipses were my late friend, Dr. Glenn Schneider, who was probably one of the great umbrophiles, one of the great eclipse chasers of all time.
Yes.
He arranged to have a flight up to the North Pole to intercept a solar eclipse in August of 2008. And then we flew over the Faroe Islands in 2015
Okay.
for another solar eclipse. But the 3 others are eclipses that I was behind the scenes with, coercing or cajoling major airlines to slightly change their itinerary or their route so that we could intercept the moon shadow and see it, total eclipse of the sun. And we were quite successful on those 3 occasions.
And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear, how did you do that? Especially, as far back as 1990.
A lot of passion went into this. The 1990 eclipse, I really didn't think about intercepting that total eclipse. It was July of 1990. And in late June, the July edition of Sky and Telescope magazine arrived in my mailbox, and there was a small article indicating that if you lived on the western United States, along the West Coast, you would be able to catch the partial stages near sunset of the total eclipse of the sun that started over Helsinki, Finland, would go across northernmost Siberia, and then would swing on down through the Aleutian Islands. And near the end of that totality path, the shadow of the moon would come close enough to the west coast of the United States to allow a bite, if you will, to appear on the setting sun for places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, Seattle. And that was basically what the whole reason to write that little blurb in Sky and Telescope was. It didn't say anything about, hey, here's an idea to try to, see the total eclipse of the sun from an airplane. But this is how my mind worked. I looked at the map. I saw that the end of the totality path was roughly midway between Honolulu and San Francisco. And I said to myself, I wonder if there are any commercial airline flights, either going from San Francisco to Honolulu or from Honolulu to San Francisco, that might be in the vicinity of the moon shadow during the time when the eclipse was reaching totality. At that time, again, this was 1990, the internet, social media was nowhere near as ubiquitous as it is today.
No, it wasn't.
So in order for me to determine whether or not there were any airlines in the vicinity of the moon shadow for this eclipse, I had to go to my local library where they had a copy of, and I don't even know if it's still being published. Maybe it is. The name of the publication is Your Airline Guide. And it looked like the Manhattan phone directory. In that book, it had the schedules of every single flight that was
Wow.
taking place with every single carrier all around the world, right on straight through the entire year. And so I sat there in my library. I was living in Levittown, Long Island at the time, sat in my library and spent a couple of hours going down all of the tables and everything. And I finally came across this one airline, which does not exist anymore, I might add, American Transair. And they had a flight 403, that left Honolulu in the late afternoon of Saturday, July 21st. And from what I was able to determine, would be close to the shadow of the moon as it passed over the Pacific Ocean. One problem was, in order for them to intercept the eclipse, I would have to coerce them to delay the flight by 41 minutes. But if we managed to do that, and if they followed the track, and I sent all kinds of information to the flight service station at ATA, American Transair. And this is another thing. You have to have somebody on your side.
Yes.
You have to have somebody who looks at this and says, you know, this might be something. And I was very fortunate to get somebody at flight control who looked at this and said, you know, this is interesting. And he said, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to bounce this off the hierarchy here at the airline and see what they think. And if they show any positive reaction, we'll get back to you. And I thought when he said that to me, I thought it was like, don't call us, we'll call you kind of thing. And I didn't think much of it. I said, well, it was, at least I gave it a shot. But lo and behold, like 2 or 3 days later, my phone rings and it's the same gentleman. His name was Mark DeHorty. And he said, would you be available for a conference call between the president of our airline, the CEO, and some of the executives here? Of course. What am I going to say? No? Of course. Yes. And so the conference call came off as scheduled. And I remember the CEO of American Transair said, all right, tell us why you think it's worthwhile to delay the flight by 41 minutes so that people could see this eclipse. Well, over the next 10 minutes, I just gave a speech about how spectacular this event was and how amazing it would be for the passengers on board to experience this particular event, this sight of sights, a total eclipse of the sun. By the time I was finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And they said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to, and he said, are you planning to be on board this flight? I said, of course I am. I would be definitely on board. He says, all right, you'll be on board. I said my wife was going to be on board. My wife, by the way, was 6 months pregnant at the time with our first child, our son, Joseph. And I also told a couple of other people about this. My best friend and best man at my wedding, Sam Storch, who was also into astronomy and into eclipses, he came on board. And another person was a gentleman by the name of Craig Small, who I think
we've talked to. We're trying to get him back. We had a little mess up with that podcast, and so we're trying to get him back to finish the. Yeah,
well, Craig jumped at the chance of being on board that flight. He brought along his lucky eclipse flag, which he brings to all of his eclipses that he travels. I think he's been to something like 35 or 40 eclipses, and every single time he's brought the flag, and every single time he's had clear weather. He has never been clouded out of a total eclipse, and he attributes it to his...
That's the guy you want to be with.
That's the guy we want to be with.
We were on a flight for the annular eclipse of 2021, and he came down the aisle after our successful viewing with the flag. So
I was with him on the 2003, which was a Glenn Schneider flight for the 2003 over Antarctica. I was on that same flight, and he brought out the flag for that too.
Yeah, it was kind of like, I've been with Craig on a few total. The first time I was ever with Craig was in 1979 when we were at a little town called Roy, Montana, for the total solar eclipse of February 26, 1979. And all I could tell you is that after we saw the eclipse, here comes Craig. He takes his flag out, and he's walking around with it. And somebody yelled out, he says, turn it around like the Stanley Cup. But Craig was on board with Sam and my wife for this eclipse that we saw from American Transair Flight 403 in 1990. And sometimes I kid my son. My son is now 35 years old, and he teaches high school physics. And I often tell him, I said, that was your first total eclipse. And he said, Dad, how could you say that? I wasn't even born yet. I was 3 months away from being born. And I kid him. I said, oh, yeah, that's right. You didn't have a womb with a view. And I go for that event. But we did see it. And I asked the captain of that flight, the American Transair flight, I said, because the people who came on board that flight had no clue that the flight was going to be delayed by 41 minutes. They just got on board thinking that, oh, we had our wonderful Hawaiian vacation, and now we can fly back to the mainland United States. And that's when the captain came on the loudspeaker, the PA, and said, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to delay this flight by 41 minutes on purpose. And you hear like a groan, like, what's going on here? He said, and now to explain to you why we're doing this, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Joe Rayo, an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in New York. And I had the mic and staring down, like 300 passengers looking at me, some of them somewhat annoyed, like, what the heck's going on here? Why?
Good. Yeah.
And I explained to them why we were doing this, why we were delaying the flight, why it was important to do that. And after I finished my little conversation and my little explanation, and by the way, Sam and Craig, my wife and I, we had distributed to all the passengers a flyer before the takeoff of why we were doing this and what the eclipse was all about. We also spent a weekend, we cut up a space blanket, those wraparound mylar blankets. We cut up a space blanket and mounted them in 35 millimeter slides, and we distributed these filters, which we told passengers they would be able to watch the partial phases using these special solar filters that we had designed and cut up from this space blanket. And after I'd finished telling everybody why we were doing this, and by the way, I asked the captain, I said, so how are you going to kill off 41 minutes? He said, I'm going to give everybody a wonderful view of the Honolulu airport. And he got on the runway and he just like slowly went all the way around. And we got a view of the airport from all different angles, killing off time until it was time for us to lift off, wheels up, and head out to intercept the total eclipse. And he also mentioned on the flight, he said, we have an action-packed evening for you on this flight. We have two Oscar-winning movies, and we also have right in the middle in between a total eclipse of the sun. They led off with Driving Miss Daisy, and then after the movie was over, came the total eclipse, and then after the total eclipse was over, we had another Oscar-winning movie, My Left Foot. So we were conveniently able to squeeze the eclipse in between the two onboard movies for this special.
Great. That's great. I did have to cringe though when you said we'll use the mylar for it, because that's a no-no now.
Well, we checked every single, and we back in the day.
It was back in the day.
Back in the day, there was a gentleman by the name of Roger Tuthill, who was an entrepreneur, and he made the discovery that mylar thoroughly reduced the infrared and ultraviolet radiations of the sun. And so he sold mylar and he called it solar screen. And so I know that there are places where you could still get mylar filtration for solar eclipses. The thing is now they have to be certified to use. These, I must tell you, were not certified, but we did test.
They were safe.
We did test every single one of them, looking and staring and say, okay, this one looks good. This one looks good. And if there were any creases or scratches or pinholes, obviously we tossed them away or whatever. But we did distribute the mylar filters, the flyers. And I'm going to tell you, a lot of people were annoyed with us, with Craig and Sam and my wife and because we're trying to watch the eclipse through our windows. And of course, to do that, we had to have the shades up. Everybody else put the shades down because they were watching the end of Driving Miss Daisy. And so when you open the shades, the light would fall on the screen, and people were saying, like, what are they doing? But when the movie thankfully ended about 5 minutes before Totality, then everybody opened their windows and shades and used the filters and were able to look at the waning crescent of the moon, which ultimately disappeared into a total solar eclipse. And afterwards, Sam later on told the captain of the flight about the fact that he wasn't interested at all in the movie Driving Miss Daisy. He said, I don't know where they were driving her. I don't care where they took her. I'm just happy that she got there in time for the total eclipse.
That's a great story, especially the fact that, you just did that first step. That first step to do all the research and old school research, the library, everything else. And yes, I did that for my first eclipse too. I actually I did enough research that I found an article from Fred Espenak, and I carried it with me to my first eclipse in 1991. And that was literally my only map. And we couldn't even get into the eclipse path. Originally, we had to go to Puerto Vallarta. I couldn't get to La Paz. So I got to Puerto Vallarta, and then I showed the map to a van driver, and he took us there. It worked. His maps were always great.
Well, the thing. Fred was indeed Mr. Eclipse.
He was Mr. Eclipse.
He was the master of eclipse calculations. Recently, for the 2024 eclipse, the so-called Great American or Great North American Eclipse that appeared from Mexico and Texas up to New England, I did a radio interview with somebody about how spectacular eclipses were. And at the end of the interview, the gentleman was running out of time. And he says, well, Joe, if nobody had told you, gave you this or christened you as yet, let me be the first. You are certainly Mr. Eclipse. And I tend to tell the guy, I said, hold it. I said, before we end this interview, I must tell you, while I'm appreciative of the title, that title belongs to one man and one man alone, Fred Espenak. And Fred indeed was Mr. Eclipse. And in fact, to this very day, Fred sadly passed away last year. But to this day, and I'm sure for years to come, all of his calculations are going to be used for expeditions and tours for future total solar eclipses.
Absolutely. In fact, we just did a podcast with timeanddate.com. They're using his calculations to actually on their site for doing all the detailed information they provide on the solar eclipses.
Right. Well, he was indeed Mr. Eclipse, and he got his knowledge through a gentleman in Belgium.
Yes,
and
Jean Meeus.
Jean Meeus. And Jean, who, like me, was actually a meteorologist for many years, but had a fancy for astronomical calculations, although his calculations, he went far beyond anybody else. And he wrote a number of different books on eclipses and astronomical calculations. And it was his book, Canon of Solar Eclipses, which I got as a Christmas gift from my mom when I was like 15 years old. And also at the time, pocket calculators were just coming into vogue. Mm-hmm. And the same thing happened with Fred. Fred, got involved with those calculations, got to know Jean on a one-to-one personal basis, and they actually co-wrote several books on eclipses. I also know Jean, not quite as well as Fred did, but I think the eclipse community owes it all to Jean Meeus, who showed us the way to do it, to show us the way to do these calculations and provide us with a foothold or a foundation to making these eclipse calculations far, far in advance. Before Jean Meeus came along, we were relying on a book that was written in the late 19th century by a gentleman named Theodor Ritter von Oppolzer, who did all his calculations by hand. And those calculations were not as rigorous and certainly not as accurate as what Meeus and later Fred Espenak was providing using computers. And to give you some idea, Oppolzer had in his book, Canon de Finstinis, Canon of Eclipses, he had the path of the 2024 eclipse passing directly over New York City. And for years, whenever you read some astronomy books and texts from the middle part of the 20th century, they always would tell you the next eclipse in New York City will be on April 8, 2024. Wrong! It was not the case. The map was not quite precise as what you would like to have. And even up until the early 70s, the former chairman of the Hayden Planetarium, Franklin Brandley, wrote a children's book. And he wrote near the end of the book that if you live in New York City, a big day will come your way on April 28, 2024, when you'll be able to see a total eclipse of the sun. And it was wrong. He was totally wrong. And we needed Jean Meeus and later, of course, Fred Espenak and others to do the correct calculations and to demonstrate that that eclipse would not be visible as a total from New York, but was visible as a total from Buffalo and Rochester and far upstate New York, like Plattsburgh, which is where I ended up seeing that particular in 2024.
And you had clear skies? Because we were touch and go down here in Texas.
The morning of the eclipse, there were a bunch of people who knew who I was and knew that I was on top of the weather. And I announced at the hotel, I said, 100% overcast. And everybody went, what? Well, what are we going to do? What are we? And I held up my arms and I said, 100% overcast, but it's going to be high, thin clouds at 28,000 feet. Don't worry, you'll see the eclipse. And in fact, if anything, the eclipse it accentuated the shadow of the moon. We were able to actually watch the shadow falling on those high clouds approaching us from the south and west, and then covered us, and we saw totality. The outer corona, well, we lost some of that because of the high altitude cloud cover, but we still got at a chance of seeing a wonderful total eclipse. 3.5 minutes of totality from upstate New York. And, you're right. I had for years, I said to myself, well, where am I going to be on April 8, 2024? Will I be in Dallas, Texas? Will I be in Little Rock, Arkansas? Maybe I'll be somewhere in the Midwest, Indianapolis, Indiana, perhaps. But no, it ended up being Plattsburgh, New York, which was great because I was able to drive from my house in Putnam Valley. I live in Putnam County, New York. So I was able to drive up Interstate 87 and go all the way up to Plattsburgh, see the eclipse, and then after we saw the eclipse, we drive all the way back down again. So I was actually able to do the eclipse from my house, which, I'm probably the only one I'm ever going to be able
partial.
to.
You got to see the partial part of it from back. Were you back in time to see the last of the partial from your house?
From my house?
You saw the total for Plattsburgh, but did you get back in time to your house to see the partial? The finish
no,
of
because
the partial?
you see the eclipse up in Plattsburgh. Everybody knew that Plattsburgh was in the path of totality, and so the hotel, for example, that we were staying at, I made reservations more than a year in advance.
Oh, you were there.
And I got the standard rate of like $140 a night for my room. But once the people at the hotel found out what was going to happen in Plattsburgh, and as the number of people asking for reservations for that date increased, I think the last rate that they were offering for a room at that hotel was $500 or $600 for a single night. And right after totality was over, we had set up at the SUNY College in Plattsburgh. Once the eclipse was over, totality had ended. Like a state trooper came along and said, well, I guess you guys are going to be stuck and you'll have to, spend the night here. Well, why? Why? He said, well, I-87 is jammed already. The people who are trying to get home from the eclipse, it was. Whereas it took maybe, I'd say about 3.5 hours to drive up to Plattsburgh for the eclipse. It took us 9 hours to get home. Yeah. Because the roads were that jammed up from all the people who had converged on Plattsburgh and upstate New York, other places like Lake Placid too. Everybody was all coming down. We actually, for the first part of our trip, we stayed away from I-87 and we took smaller side routes. And it was very funny because here we are, we're taking like side streets or whatever. And there were people who were living on those streets, communities or whatever like that, who were waving at us and saying, hey, we saw the eclipse. And, this is probably the biggest event that had ever taken place up in that area in recent years and for many years. And don't forget, for the weeks leading up to the eclipse, our Governor Hochul, had the electronic highway signs lit up, telling everybody and alerting everybody, solar eclipse April 8th, get there early, stay late. Because they knew that the roadways every which way were going to be jammed with people who wanted to see the total eclipse.
Yeah, the traffic is always bad on the days after. I usually stay the night of. After the eclipse, I usually stay over and let the traffic die down and then go to the next day. But even then, it could be still, other people do the same. It's because like the 2017 eclipse, we wanted to do some sightseeing in Oregon. It took us a long time to get to where we needed to go. But what's really interesting.
And that's something that did not happen in the earlier years, in the 1960s and 70s, that there was a total eclipse of the sun over a part of the United States. You could make your reservations at a hotel, let's say a couple of days in advance, or you could drive up and have no problem in running into traffic problems because it's simply nobody really was into it back in those days. It's not the way it is now with social media urging you, telling you must go see this event, and that's why within a matter of months, or about a year beforehand, all the hotel reservations are gone. And on the day of the event, day before, the day after, the roads are so jam-packed with people. But that did happen. My first eclipse in 1972, my grandfather had driven me and my grandmother and my mom and my sister. We took a trip up to the Gaspé Peninsula of southeastern Quebec. And we left on a Saturday afternoon. We drove up I-87, no problems there. We stopped on the Saturday night, the 8th of July, in Montreal. The next day, we left Montreal and we traveled up to Quebec City. Again, no problems. And on the morning of the eclipse, July the 10th, we got into our car. It was becoming heavily overcast over Quebec City. My grandfather looked up at the sky and said, "It's looked bad. We may not be able to see it at all." But we drove out from underneath the clouds to see the eclipse in Cap Chat, which was on the Gaspé Peninsula. And as we're driving up toward Cap Chat from Quebec City, there was nobody on the roads. The roads were absolutely empty for much of the trip. My grandmother nudged me and kiddingly said, "Are you sure this is the right day for the eclipse?" But it was interesting, once we crossed over into the path of totality, which was about 130 miles wide, once we moved into the edge of totality, we saw a guy on the road, and he had his telescope set up on the side of the road, and my grandfather honked his horn. We gave him the thumbs up, and as we got further and further along, deeper and deeper into the total eclipse track, more and more people started appearing on each side of the road. And when we got to Cap Chat, forget about it. Cap Chat was a town of about, back then, 2,000 people. There were about 25,000 people who had come to Cap Chat to see the total eclipse of the sun. And my best way of describing Cap Chat to you is if you've ever watched the Andy Griffith Show and saw the fictional town of Mayberry, North Carolina. Cap Chat was Mayberry, North Carolina. Everything was in French, though. I mean, but if you can imagine a total eclipse of the sun coming to Mayberry, that was what it was like going to Cap Chat, although everybody was talking in French, and that was it. But fortunately, I made a hotel reservation at the Hotel Minuet, one of the last hotels that were offering rooms, and it was this little hole in the wall in downtown Cap Chat. And when my grandmother got a chance to see the room and also found out that in order to go to the bathroom, she'd have to share the bathroom with like 6 other people who were on the same floor. The bathroom were down the hall.
Yep.
From my grandfather, there ain't no way that we're staying here. And so after totality and after the eclipse was over, we all got back in our car, in the car, and we traveled back to Quebec City, which was like 4 or 5. So think about this. My grandfather drove like 4 or 5 hours from Quebec City up to the Gaspé Peninsula to see the total eclipse. We spent a few hours up there, and then we turned around and we went back to Quebec City instead of spending the night at the local hotel in Cap Chat.
That's a long drive. So the reason I gotten your eclipses wrong, I think you need to update eclipse chasers, because they had you at 14 and 12.
The eclipse chasing list.
Yeah.
I think Bill Kramer is involved. I haven't had a chance really. And I got to tell you, I never, in my wildest dreams, back in 1973, a couple of months before the big eclipse that occurred over Africa, June 30th, 1973, which I did not see. I was actually in Spain for that one, so I saw a small partial eclipse. But a few months before that, at the Hayden Planetarium, they had a special gathering of eclipse chasers, all the people who were going to be on the Canberra, at that time one of the biggest cruise ships in the world that was embarked off of Africa for that particular eclipse. And so at that eclipse, the then chairman or head of the Hayden Planetarium, his name was Mark Chartrand, commented during that gathering, that get-together, that in the audience there was Dr. Charles Smiley of Brown University, and he was going to attempt to see with that upcoming eclipse, that long eclipse on the Canberra. They had like 5.5 minutes of totality. He was attempting to push his total eclipse viewing time to 30 minutes. He had seen something like 12 or 13 total eclipses, and he passed away with 14 under his belt. And I was sitting next to Glenn Schneider, who I just met Glenn some weeks before him.
Okay.
We were volunteers at that time at the Hall of Science. And when we found out that we each had the same passion for eclipses, that's when we really got to know each other and everything else. But when Dr. Chartrand said we were honored to have Dr. Smiley here, he's seen like 12 or 13 eclipses, and he's going to attempt to push his total eclipse viewing time to over 30 minutes. That's when Glenn leaned over to me and he said, well, I'm done. I'm going to leave Smiley in his dust. He said, I'm going to see every total eclipse of the sun that takes place for the rest of my life. And sure enough, Glenn saw, I think, like 35 eclipses.
Yeah.
He held to his word and did that. But in 1973, he had only seen 2 or 3. And I leaned over to Glenn and I said, if I can see half as many as Dr. Smiley has seen, I'll be happy, which meant I was thinking that maybe I might see in my life 6 or 7. Well, here is the number now, 14.
Yeah.
I just recently passed Dr. Smiley by going over 30 minutes myself and seeing
Good.
Totality. I have basked in the shadow of the moon for over 30 minutes now. I'm hoping that before I leave this world of ours, that I will go to see 20. 20 is my magic number. This upcoming eclipse in August will be number 15 for me. And like I said, I'm hoping that I'll be able to extend that to a few more eclipses and make it 20. And I'm already a very happy camper. I've seen far more than I've ever expected to see, but not only just from the ground, but again, by land, by sea, by air. It's been an amazing time in chasing these things all around the world.
Yeah, Chris and I are in the Glenn Schneider camp.
Yeah. But you have a big one coming up, this very next one here in a few weeks. That is your first exeligmos eclipse, your third Saros. Is this true?
If you're into chasing eclipses, or if you're into eclipses, you know about the Saros cycle. You know that because of an unusual coincidence and combination of different cycles, that a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse will recur on the surface of the Earth after 18 years, 10 or 11 and a third days. And that third of a day is important because the third of the day means that when the eclipse comes back and repeats itself, it will recur not in the same spot that it took place 18 years earlier, but on another spot, 1/3 of a rotation of the Earth, or 8 hours later. But after 3 Saroses, you go hit 3 times 8, that's 24. 24 means that after 3 Saros cycles, you come to an eclipse that pretty much occurs over the same region of the world that occurred 54 years and 1 month earlier. It is called an exeligmos, Greek for the turning of the wheel. So if you have, so to speak, if you have managed to see 3 different Saros cycles in a row, when you go for the 4th Saros, you will be, again, turning the wheel, so to speak. You will be coming back more or less to the same region of the world, or the same region of the globe that you saw the first in the cycle 54 years earlier. And so I had written an article in the op-ed section of Sky and Telescope. They call it Focal Point. And I had mentioned how I had seen the first eclipse was by my grandparents. That was in 1972. That belonged to Saros cycle 126. When 126 returned in 1990, I saw the one from American Transair, the one over the Pacific Ocean.
That one, okay.
Yes, in 2008, I saw another member of Saros 126. That one was one that Glenn Schneider had organized on a flight from Dusseldorf, Germany, up to the North Pole. And on our way up to the North Pole, we managed to intercept a total eclipse of the sun, which lasted about almost 3 minutes. And so that was, again, another member of the same Saros cycle, 126. So now, 18 years after that, from 2008 now, here we are in 2026. And so now I'm going to see the last in the cycle of Saros eclipses belonging to cycle 126. And so I will have turned the wheel, so to speak, and completed the entire triple Saros cycle, the exeligmos, as it's called, and we'll have seen eclipses belonging to this one particular cycle of solar eclipses. And it's interesting, there have been people who have seen far more eclipses than I have, but to be able to string together eclipses that belong to the same family or the same cycle, that's a very difficult and daunting thing to do. But I'll be able to do it. Glenn would have done it, certainly. And sadly, as I said, he passed away last year. So as I said in the finishing out the op-ed piece. I will be in 2026 in August. We'll be in the Balearic Sea observing that eclipse in 26 for me, and turning the wheel also for Glenn.
And then,
Nice.
and in the spirit of Glenn's flight, a friend that introduced us, John Beatty, actually has a flight out of Reykjavik to see this eclipse over Iceland.
Yeah, John is very big into these eclipses, and in fact, when Craig Small was celebrating, I think, his 70th birthday party, it was a surprise birthday party at a restaurant. I was there, my wife was there, because we had known Craig for many, many years. And also they invited John Beatty. And John, this shows you what kind of, umbrophile John was. John Beatty bought all of these maps and charts of the upcoming, it was only going to be a couple of months ahead of Craig's birthday, the 2017 eclipse. And he brought all of these maps that he put up on the wall here. Now, I have to tell you, most of the people who were at the party were not eclipse chasers. They just happened to be friends of Craig Small. And I said to John B., I said, what the heck are you doing? I mean, what do you do? Why did you do all of this? He said, well, maybe I might be interested, get people interested. I know that they might come. And I know that he would put together a flight for that eclipse in 2017. And so he was looking for people to convince or coerce to come on board for that eclipse with him. But it just goes to show you that he's really, one of these people that really is, I guess he lives by the map, so to speak, eclipse maps. And I knew he was going to try to fly out to see this eclipse coming up in 2024. That's his thing. He's into air flying now. I think he was clouded out of the 1991 eclipse in Mexico, the long
Hawaii.
In Hawaii?
Yeah, Hawaii. Mexico got to see it. Hawaii didn't. Yeah.
Well, I think he was in Mexico though, and he happened to. There was one particular area of Mexico that he went to that, believe it or not, had cloud cover. And
wow.
you'll have to ask him about that. But I'm pretty sure it was Mexico that he missed out on. Yeah, Hawaii got clouded out for the most part of the 91 eclipse. But ever since then, he's gone for the airborne flights, which pretty much places you above the clouds and pretty much guarantees you that you're going to see totality.
Yeah. Well, we're going to Chris and I are both going to Spain on different tours, but and we have the big risk of getting clouded out. But we're going on land. I'm taking friends and family with me this time.
Well, I know that there are people. There are some cruises that are leaving from Reykjavik, and they're planning to go up to Greenland. They're planning to go to a place called Solesby Sund, or Sound, which is a fjord that apparently receives cold winds that blow. We call them catabatic winds that blow down from the ice cap on Greenland. They're cold, they're dry, and they tend to be clear. And the hope is that people who go to that particular region of Greenland, the wind will be blowing and will allow to break or open up any cloud cover that's in the area and allow for a view of the total eclipse of the sun from Greenland. Greenland otherwise doesn't have, and neither does Iceland, very good chances for totality.
Right.
The best weather prospects are for Spain, but unfortunately, the drawback for Spain and the drawback for the ship that I'm going to be on, the Le Boreal of the Ponant cruise lines, is that the sun is going to be exceedingly low to the horizon.
Very low.
And so all you need is one cloud near the horizon, and you'll get screwed by not seeing totality. So we're hoping that that's going to be not the case. We're hoping that we will have clear weather. I've done a little bit of research and found that in between the years 2021 and 2025, at 8 o'clock in the evening local time, that there have been a number of cases. About 50% of them have been clear. 50% have, about 40% have been clouded over, and 10%, depending upon where the ship was and where the cloud was, you either saw it or you didn't see it.
Yeah.
So it's going to be highly dependent upon what's looming near the horizon when totality occurs in 2026 for us. But hopefully we will get a break and we will have a chance of seeing totality.
You will have a good time on the Le Boreal Ponant. It's a beautiful ship. Letitia and I went on it in 21 for the Antarctic eclipse, and we got clouded out. But the cruise itself was lovely, and
Yes.
the boat was lovely.
Well, that's interesting because I was on a 2021 eclipse, and it was not the Le Boreal. I think it was La Choteau. Darn it, I don't remember the name of the ship. But we were clouded out of that 2021 eclipse. And I have to tell you that I was offered the chance to go on that cruise and be a lecturer a few months earlier. Ponant came to me and they said, you've been. Actually, they didn't come. The person who offered it to me was a gentleman by the name of Rick Feinberg, the former editor-in-chief
Yeah.
of Sky and Telescope, and a member of the AAS, the American Astronomical
Yes.
Society.
We know Rick.
And he said, Joe, what are you doing for the Antarctic eclipse? And I laughed at his face. I said, what, are you crazy? I'm not going to Antarctica. I said, it's going to be cloudy down there. Why would I spend all that time? And he told me, he said later on, he says, you're not looking at the big picture. The big picture is the eclipse, seeing the eclipse would be the icing on the cake. But the cake is the cruise. You're being offered 2 weeks to see a part of the world, an exotic area that you may never be offered again. And as it turned out, my wife and I, we did eventually go on the cruise. I did give talks on behalf of Ponant for that eclipse. And the bottom line of it is I must have did a good job because a year ago, Ponant came to me and they said, hey, we'd like to have you on board again for the 2026 eclipse. Are you interested? Oh, of course I'm interested. And I signed right on with that, and that's how we're ending up going with Ponant again in 2026. And P.S., I'm also going to be on board for their 2027 eclipse cruise
nice.
near Gibraltar.
Nice.
And the 2028 cruise that they're offering, that's going to be off the Kimberley region of Australia.
That's
And I
wonderful.
said to my wife the other day, I said, it's damn lucky that I didn't turn them down and I went on that Antarctic expedition because if I turned them down, I wouldn't have been offered all of these other eclipse cruises. And so here we are. I'm pretty much set now for the next 3 eclipses.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That is really awesome. Wow. So you'll be seeing it's the one from Gibraltar, and then from Kimberley. Kimberley, is that West Coast or East Coast?
Kimberley is on the northwest. If you look at a map of Australia, the eclipse track is going to track from northwest to southeast. It's going to cut Australia almost in half, diagonal,
Right.
from north to southeast, and it leaves the Australia. It's going to leave Australia over Sydney. So Sydney is directly in the path of the total eclipse. But when Ponant asked me for my opinion as to where to put a ship for the Australian eclipse, I guess they were thinking, Sydney, but I said, no. Sydney has a tempestuous weather pattern. You could have a few great sunny days, but you could also have a few days cloudy, rainy weather. If you go to the Kimberley region, northwest coast of Australia, besides the fact that there isn't very much going on up there, it's out in the outback, so to speak. But the weather in that part of Australia at that time of the year, July, it's their winter season, they get only in the month of July maybe a few millimeters of rain. And with the mobility of the ship, there be any clouds in Australia in late July in that vicinity, we could certainly move whatever ship that Ponant is going to use to move out of the cloud cover and into clear weather. And that's going to also be a long eclipse. That's going to be over 5 minutes of totality.
I know. It's going to be a great eclipse.
Yeah.
It's going to be longer than the one we saw in 2023. And Chris and I were in the Exmouth area, which is kind of in that region. But we saw the 2023, but that was only like a 59-second eclipse.
For us. Yeah.
That was a hybrid eclipse. That was an annular total eclipse.
No, it was a total.
It was beautiful.
Right. Where you were, it was in the total part of the eclipse track, but the entire time,
it was a hybrid.
It was a hybrid. It was a hybrid.
Right.
You're
It
right.
started as an annular, then the shadow of the moon got close enough to scrape, so to speak, the surface of the Earth. And wherever you were, where it was scraping the Earth, you had a very narrow but also very short, relatively short period of totality. And then after that, the shadow moved off the surface of the Earth again, and it converted back to being an annular or ring eclipse. But you were in the zone where you had about, 60 seconds of totality.
60 seconds of totality. It was because, like you said, it was a very tight shadow. We got some really great corona effects.
And
There was
prominences as well.
prominences were
and
amazing.
The chromosphere. The chromosphere was what amazed me, was seeing such a long extended, and for a long period of time, relatively speaking, to the actual totality itself.
It sounds very similar to the eclipse that I saw again on a cruise ship. I convinced, and this cruise line does not exist anymore, but it's the Regal Cruise Lines. And in 1999, August of 1999, everybody and his uncle was planning to see totality from Europe. The eclipse passed over a part of the UK. They also passed over France and Germany. In fact, before I proposed to my wife, who is German, her name is Renata, and I told my wife, I said, I will take you to that solar eclipse in 1999. We'll go to Stuttgart in Germany. I promised her a trip to Germany in 1999. But in the interim, after we got married in 1984, in the interim, I managed to coerce Regal Cruise Lines to position themselves for a view of that total eclipse, not anywhere in Europe, but actually in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Nova Scotia. The eclipse track began a couple of 100 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia. And so we actually sailed out of New York City and took a trek. It was a whale watching cruise. They spent 2 weeks whale watching in the Canadian Maritimes of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, looking for whales and also puffins and other things. But when I explained to them that there was going to be a total eclipse of the sun that was going to occur right after sunrise from the vicinity of Nova Scotia, they said, wow, well, let's build that into the eclipse, the regular itinerary of our cruise. And so I ended up going there, and I had to apologize to my wife. I said, I promised you Germany. I will take you someday to Germany. But this time around, we're not seeing Germany. We're going to go and watch the eclipse from off of Nova Scotia. They called it the Ship of Fools, by the way, because everybody said, what are they doing? They're going to go see a total eclipse of the sun off Nova Scotia in midsummer at sunrise? Everybody knows, and Jay Anderson, who is an eclipse expert in terms of meteorology, he pointed out, he said at that time of the year, it's usually cloudy and foggy along the maritime coast at sunrise for the month of August. And so everybody's saying, and who would go to see an eclipse at sunrise, which is almost going to certainly be clouded out? Guess what? It turned out to be perfectly clear. We had 50 seconds of the most beautiful totality that you ever saw. As you had mentioned, it was because it was 50 seconds, we had a beautiful chromospheric ring surrounding the black disk of the moon. And because the fact that the sun was only about a degree or two above the horizon, the moon illusion kicked in. You know how when the moon and the sun appear very, very large when they rise or they set? We had a gigantic corona, let me put it that way, sitting over the eastern horizon. And for 50 seconds, we had this view of totality. It was the most incredible view. And P.S., had we gone to Stuttgart in Germany or to England, it was cloudy, and in fact, in Stuttgart, it rained for the eclipse.
But that's awesome. That's on my bucket list, is to see a sunrise eclipse. I've yet to see one. I've seen sunset.
This one's going to be reversed. The one I'm seeing coming up in August, that's going to be a sunset eclipse.
So you got them both now. I've seen sunset before. I've seen two sunset, the 2002 and the 2010. So this will be my third sunset eclipse, but I do want to see a sunrise somewhere.
It was amazing because the sun came up looking like lobster claws. Mm-hmm. It was already like 80% covered. Wow. And so we had this crescent sun coming up, which thinned out. And then again, some minutes after sunrise came the moment of totality, and boom, came this amazing view of the total solar eclipse. I remember right after the eclipse was over, the captain of the ship, his name was Captain Schwab. The captain said, should I sound the horn? And I said, yeah, go ahead. And so right at the totality, whoa.
So do you get the same effect that you get at sunset where the shadow kind of comes across the sky?
Yeah, I said with that eclipse, the sunrise eclipse, it appeared to me like I was looking inside of a corridor of darkness.
Yeah.
And that the shadow sweeps in, from right to left. And so it sweeps in, and as soon as the entire sun is within that bar of darkness, you have totality. And then during the middle part of totality, I'm looking at the sun. Here's the totally eclipsed sun. Here's this corridor of darkness, and to my right and to my left, outside of the shadow, you see, it's light, and you see sunrise or sunset colors. So it's very interesting. During totality of a sunrise or a sunset eclipse, you're looking more or less right down the axis of the shadow of the moon, and so that's why you get this unusual effect that you don't often get if you see an eclipse where the sun is high in the sky. You get this weird effect of again this corridor of darkness instead of the usual effect of the shadow just sweeping over you and covering your entire area. During a regular, or when the sun is high in the sky, you can almost see the ellipse covering the entire sky of the shadow. But during a sunrise or sunset eclipse, again, you're looking straight down the axis of the shadow, and so you're looking at the sun inside of this corridor of darkness with light on both sides instead.
Yeah,
It's an
I love that
interesting-
effect.
Wow.
I have one more question for you. We're getting close to time here, and I want to make sure I keep you on track. What do you recommend to others about if they've never seen, if this is their first solar eclipse or maybe their second? What do you recommend to others about chasing them?
You chase them. You of course find out where the eclipse is going to take place. I presume if you go on your own, you'll be looking at most likely online maps that have been created by, again, our late great friend Fred Espenak. If you're going with a tour, everything will be pretty much provided for you in advance. The one thing that I would suggest, if this is your very first eclipse, do not, I repeat, do not attempt to photograph it. What you ought to do is you should just absorb the entire event. Don't get yourself. The one thing I really did not like to see during the most recent eclipse in 2024, and I saw several videos of that eclipse, and during the moment when the sun was in totality, all of a sudden you see this group of people taking their phones and holding it up to the sun, and now they're looking at totality, the entire 2 or 3 or 4 minutes of totality through that little tiny screen on their phone. They weren't looking at anything else. They weren't looking around and looking at the changing sky colors around the horizon or the stars and planets that popped into view. All they did was just look at the eclipse through their phone. I mean, that's not the way to do it. If you want to really appreciate it for the first time, I guarantee you there will be pictures in the aftermath taken by others, veteran eclipse watchers who are probably taking eclipse photos using automatic devices and cameras, and the shutters going off on its own. But take full advantage of your first eclipse by just looking around, observing, looking at all of the amazing sights that were occurring, and especially so if you have binoculars. Take a look at that corona through binoculars or with a small wide-angle telescope so that you can see the beautiful effects of the corona and the prominences. One of my eclipse mentors, a gentleman by the name of Fred Hess, who for many years was a lecturer at the Hayden Planetarium and himself observed many total eclipses. He would describe the corona as a great crown, a halo, the corona of the sun that becomes visible, streaming outward, he would say, ragged at the edge, streaks running through it. And when the corona first forms, you might see that flash of light as the last ray of sunlight sweeps past the rugged, rough edge of the moon, creating a diamond ring in the sky. All of these effects are completely gone by the wayside if you're going to spend all of that time looking at your little tiny screen on your phone. Don't do that. If you're going to see your first total eclipse, take advantage, absorb the eclipse, look around, use those binoculars, use that telescope. I know a friend, a long-time friend who also sadly passed away a few years ago. He was probably known as the Carl Sagan of Canada, Terence Dickinson. Terry Dickinson, in 1979, went to see his first total eclipse. He planned to photograph it through his big telescope. But as soon as totality hit and he saw what was in the sky, he said, I knew immediately I would never be able to photograph this. And he wrenched the camera off the telescope slipped in a wide-angle eyepiece, and spent that entire 2.5 minutes absorbing and looking at totality through his telescope, drinking up the wonders and glories of the total solar eclipse. So again, if you're going to your first view of an eclipse, there'll be other eclipses, I'm sure, but if it's your first one, take full advantage of it and just see it the way it's meant to be seen in its full glory with your own two eyes, and again, all of the accompanying phenomena that lead up to it and lead out of it, like the shadow bands, the stars, the planets, the moving shadows that's passing across the sky. All of these things are things that, if you don't see another total eclipse, are things that you may never get a chance to see again.
And I agree with you. I'm still, after 21, I'm up to 21 now. And after 21 eclipses, my husband will bring a camera and he's welcome to it, but I'll put a camera down, I'll shove it in the ground, put it on a stand, hit record, and just let it go, and then just enjoy the eclipse. That's it. And that's after 21. That's all I want to do is experience, because it's just such a magical moment for me.
It never gets old. It never gets old. And somebody once said to me, he said, I've seen eclipses of all different durations, short eclipses, very long eclipses. You know what? He said, every single eclipse I've seen lasted all of 8 seconds. Because that's how it's only an 8 seconds of totality. Where did it go?
I usually say 30. I do give it 30 seconds. I'll say 30.
I tell you what, the weird thing about eclipses, and I'm sure you've seen having 21 or how many that you've seen, the first 20 or 30 seconds, people scream their heads off. They scream their heads off for the first 20 or 30 seconds, and then everything becomes silent. Everybody gets quiet, and everybody just looks. And then what you hear are murmurs of people saying, "Oh, look at that! Look at it! That's amazing!" And the clicks of the camera shutters and everything else. And then that builds again to a crescendo as the sun comes back out, marking the end of totality. I want to tell you one quick story, and it involves a cruise. My very first eclipse cruise in 1988. My wife and I, we were both meteorologists, and we were both working at the same company. And so we would start our day at like 5 o'clock in the morning. We'd come home at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This is 1988 BC, before children. We came home, and you sit back after, you relax, and one of the magazines that she used to read from was Better Homes and Garden. I opened up Better Homes and Garden, just flicking through, and I saw an ad for American Hawaii cruises. And I knew that in 1991, we were going to have the eclipse over the Hawaiian Islands. So I said to myself, I wonder if they're aware of that. And so the next day, I called up the corporate offices of American Hawaii Cruises, and I told them about the 1991 eclipse coming up 3 years hence. Right. And I said, you really ought to consider doing a cruise for that eclipse, because it's going to be a big event. It's going to be major. And the person on the other end of the line simply said, well, we don't need a total eclipse of the sun to get passengers to come on board. July is our high season. We always sell out a cruise. We appreciate you telling about that, but it's no big deal to us. It's not anything that we're really planning to do. So I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And I had just had a book published by Sky Publishing. It was called Your Guide to the Great Solar Eclipse of July 1991. I said, I'm going to send you a copy of this book. And it shows you, and I'll have maps showing how the eclipse will interact with Hawaii and all about how spectacular this event is. I'll just send you that book. You could look at it or whatever like that. And I said, oh, fine. Thank you very much. And I did that. I mailed the next day a copy of my book and a cover letter to American Hawaii Cruises. And then I forgot all about them. I never heard from them again for a full year. And then now here's 1989. And the phone rings, and it's American Hawaii Cruises. And the person I spoke with was a completely different person. She was the woman who was in charge of promotions. And she said, well, about the eclipse coming up in a couple of years, we've been getting phone calls. She said, now initially when we were getting phone calls, we would tell people we're not planning anything special for the eclipse. And they said, oh, you're not? Really? Then the phone calls started coming in and saying, you're not going to see the eclipse? You're not planning to do anything for the eclipse? Why? And now it's gotten to the point where when people call us to ask us about the eclipse, they basically are saying we're idiots. He said, what are you? You're dumb. You're not doing anything. This is going to be one of the great eclipses of the century. It's happening right over Hawaii, and you're not planning to do anything about it? how stupid are you, whatever. And so he said, all of us had a meeting, and somebody remembered that you had sent us some information about it a year ago. And I'm looking at it, all this stuff right now. And the bottom line is, would you help us put together an eclipse cruise and a theme cruise for this eclipse? And I said, I'm in. I'm fine. If I can go on with my wife. And she said, well, I'm going to come to New York. And I said, oh, so you're coming to New York? He said, yes, we're going to meet with you. And we made arrangements to be at the Hayden Planetarium, where I used the Zeiss Planetarium projector to demonstrate what an eclipse looked like in the sky. Zeiss projector. And then I asked her, I said, so where are you staying in New York? She said, oh, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. That's probably like top of the line hotel in New York.
It is.
I mean, you got to have that money. And I said to myself, if they got this money to send a woman to, to this meeting, to putting her up in the Waldorf, I said, well, I'm terribly sorry. And she said, what do you mean? He says, well, I'm already spoken for this eclipse. We're going to, and I said, Sky and Telescope had signed on. I'd signed on for an eclipse tour with them. And I said, and not just my wife, I said, my sister and my brother-in-laws, my wife's brothers. It's so rough would it go on that. I said, unless you can somehow manage to, convince me otherwise. And she looked at me and says, will 2 staterooms be on the cruise be good for you? Said, we'll pay for everything. The staterooms will fly you out there, everything, come back. He says, but we really need somebody like you as an expert to be on board on the cruise. And I said, okay. What I just told her was a total lie. There was nothing to do with any other tour at that point in line. Neither did my sister, neither did my wife's 2 brothers. But we ended up going on an eclipse cruise, myself, my wife, my sister, and my 2 brother-in-laws. And we had a fantastic time. And we put together a great cruise. We had, they asked me about who might be interested in coming on board. We got Fred Pohl, who was a very famous science fiction writer.
Yes, I've read his book.
We wanted to get Asimov, but Asimov said, I don't fly. Yeah. I don't fly to Hawaii. I don't do anything. So we had to get Fred Pohl, who was a great science fiction thing. We got 2 of the best astrophotographers who photographed the total eclipse of the sun and made the cover of Life magazine, Bob Little and George Keane. So we got them. And we also got on board our cruise Michael Collins, who was the man who was in the command module for the Apollo 11. While Armstrong and Aldrin cavorted on the moon, Michael Collins, of course, went around the moon in the command module, and he was on board our theme cruise. And I got to know Mike Collins really well. In fact, the day before, I was worried about the weather. It didn't look like we were going to have clear weather, and I was like pulling my hair out. Mike Collins used to jog. Can you imagine? One of the 3 astronauts of Apollo 11, each morning, he used to jog around the promenade deck. And 1 mile around the promenade deck was, 4 times around the promenade deck was 1 mile on our ship. And when he saw me one morning, like, the weather doesn't look good, he said, come with me. He says, we're going to have breakfast. And I had breakfast with Mike Collins. And I'm saying to myself, as I'm sitting across from Mike Collins, I'm having breakfast with one of the 3 astronauts who went on to the first flight to land men on the moon. Yeah. And he was a wonderful, wonderful person. And aside from the eclipse itself, the highlight of my being on board that eclipse cruise was being with the astronaut on board Apollo 11. And it wouldn't have happened, none of that would have happened if I hadn't decided to call up American Hawaii Cruises after seeing an ad in Better Homes in Garden 3 years earlier. So it just goes to show you what you could do. I've written letters to, airlines and have gotten, things have happened from that. I called up, cruise lines and got stuff. And I underscore the fact that you can do anything if you set your mind to it. And if you're a good salesman and if you have that passion. One of the people on board Alaska Airlines was interviewed by somebody from the news media. Why did you go ahead and do this flight, the Diverture flight, to see a total eclipse? And the gentleman said, it was because of Joe Rayo. He said, Joe Rayo, he had the passion just spilled out all over from him and onto us. And when he spoke about how impressive the eclipse was, we got excited about it too. And that's why we ended up doing what we did with our with our flight. So don't, if you think that you might be able to change minds and get cruise lines and airlines to change their courses so you can see a total eclipse, go ahead and try it. You never know what's going to happen.
Well, thank you, Joe.
Wow, that's
Wow. Great close
great,
there.
great advice for first-time eclipse chasers. That's the best
Yeah.
advice that we've heard from people. I've heard from people.
And we
that
know
we've
you
had.
need to go soon, but please don't leave. We need to stop the recording and make sure everything uploads.
Yeah. So thank you so much for coming. It was fantastic.
No
We're-
problem. Thank you for asking me. And I've seen some of the people who you've already interviewed, and it's an honor to be added to that guest role.
Thank you.
Honor's ours. Great to have you. So thank you. Well, that's it for this episode of Totality Talks. Hope you enjoyed our chat with Joe. In the next episode, we have the co-author of the book Chasing Totality, Jared Coe. As always, clear skies.